Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it's time again for the weekly Flicker Picayune. So turn down those lights and pass the popcorn as we celebrate the life and many loves of the Sonic Cinema Experience. And now, here he is, the Wikipedia of Wonders, the Prince of Panavision, the Sultan of the Silver Screen, the one, the only, Dr. Albatross.
Well, hello there, and welcome. I am Dr. Albatross, and this is the weekly Flicker Picayune podcast episode 2. Today's program is called Cine-Magic. Oh, yes, it will be quite intriguing. And my guest today is another member of the Sonic Cinema Experience. He is a world-renowned magician and mentalist, a teacher, a mentor, and all-around mensch. He's also a gifted musician. My good friend, Kenton Nepper.
Hey, Doc. Sorry, this is Ed. Yeah, it looks like Kenton is not going to make it on today's show. He's busy right now.
Really? Well, what is he doing?
Well, right now, Kenton is levitating a piano.
Levitating a piano? Oh, my.
Yeah. So, you see, I probably don't want to disturb him right now. I mean, if I break his concentration, he might drop that thing, and that would really upset Mrs. Clatter downstairs.
If you don't mind me asking, why is Kenton levitating a piano?
I knew you were going to get around to asking that question. So, okay, so here's what happened. Karen is working on a new song for the show, and Kenton was playing the piano for her to practice with, and she, quite innocently enough, asked if he could play it any higher.
So he
levitated the piano.
Well, Ed, today's topic is Cine-Magic. And one of the things that Sonic Cinema is known for is pointing out the connection between the art of magic and the art of movies. Tell us a bit more about that connection.
Well, Doctor, there seems to be a really huge connection between the art of magic and movies, and this is the main topic that our live performance between playing music for the silent movies, we perform the magic, and this is what we talk about, the connection between how magic influenced the creation of early cinema, and then how cinema, as it has gone through many evolutions to its high-tech point of existence now, this idea of magic, the influence of stage magic and the concepts of magic, both symbolic and in performance, illusion, are all still huge influences there. And so as you go back to the origins of film, amazingly, you find that it is the magician that is the primary character dominating experimentation with this early medium. The film is created, the projector, they kind of cracked the code on the projector. You know, the whole thing started with a zeotrope that you would spin around, had the horse galloping, and because the shutter openings in the window and this little illuminated round toy, basically, the shutter passed by as the little single frames went past. It gave the illusion that the horse was galloping. Oh. And that was the beginning of creating the illusion of motion using pictures.
Interesting.
So that then evolves to a film projector that projects at a standard rate. This also means that back then, of course, the silent movie cameras were cranked by hand. So trying to regulate the speed at which any given cameraman was cranking the camera was also difficult until we came up with motorized cameras that could run at a standard speed. But these were the challenges they faced, and they came up with a way to make the films, and then you would have a little loop of film. And The question was what to do with it. These early films were static shots. It was the camera locked in one place looking at a subject. And these early films would be a minute long.
Oh.
They were put in the little machines, basically kind of Nickelodeon machines, and people would go up and put their nickel in and look in the little viewer. It had a little viewer that came up to your eyes, and you would turn the crank. And you turn the crank and you would see this 1 minute film loop go over and over again. That was before they were being projected out on a larger screen. It was for individual viewing. So the people who had motion picture technology were struggling now with knowing what to do with this innovative art form and how to make it entertaining, have people put that nickel in there that wanted to see this loop. There were a couple of answers in early film.
Oh, really?
One of them was you could make those 1 minute film loops a little bit naughty.
Ooh.
Yeah, there are some famous early films of a lady doing a fan dance, a dance of the seven veils. Having a woman swirl around in very little clothing was an enormously popular subject for those early film loops. And you'd be surprised what all you could fit in a minute.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yes. So you would get to see quite a lot in those little film loops, short of anything that was at that time considered indecent. The other thing that became a staple was showing a magician.
Oh.
And it turns out that the people who had the technology, if you were wealthy enough to afford a movie camera and to process the film and maybe get one of these crank devices to watch it back, the question was, what are we going to do with this? Well, it was the magicians who actually came alongside this. I'll give you some examples. This motion pictures basically got projection back to replay for people so they could watch these strips of film that had been developed. That was in the late 1800s, the 1890s. By 1895, then you're having more progression in terms of how these things can be shown, but there's nothing really happening artistic with them. In 1900, one of these early films that was in the hand-cranked individual viewer was a film that Thomas Edison made, and it's called, this is going to surprise you, The Magician.
Oh.
And in it, a magician comes to into this room. There's a screen behind him and a chair to his right, and he's dressed like a typical magician. In fact, he's dressed, mustache and everything, very much like a man who was a famous illusionist at the time named David Devant. And we will talk more about David Devant and some of the things he did for theater and for film as we go on to future episodes. But the man comes in and he removes his gloves. He was in full tuxedo and evening wear. He removes the gloves, tosses them into the air, and they vanish.
Mysterious.
This was a trick used on stage by many stage magicians. He took off his top hat, and likewise it vanished. And so he goes through a series of these things, taking off his gloves and his hat and his scarf, and they all vanish. And at a certain point, he pulls a handkerchief from his pocket, and it becomes a big bundle of streamers that are set over the chair that's next to him. He shows his hands empty, pulls his sleeves up, picks up the streamers, shakes them, and out come a duck and some birds go flying out of it. So the birds have magically appeared.
Oh.
What's fascinating about that little film, all of which takes place in a minute, is that the technique that's being used to accomplish the magician's trick is called a jump cut. And a jump cut, for those of you who don't speak film, it's a technique that was used a lot. You've seen television shows like Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie, and still some versions of that being done now. It was very primitive. Basically, the actor would go in there, like the man's going to vanish the gloves off of his evening wear collection. He would take the gloves, hold it in his hand, raise them up over his head, and freeze. At that point, an assistant would walk onto the set, remove the gloves from his hand so the man didn't change positions at all. The assistant would leave the set, and crank the camera, resume action. So they made a cut in the film, and the part that you didn't see in real time was where the assistant came and removed the gloves from his hand. On screen, it appears that he held them up in his hand, and they were gone. Oh. So the movies now have a technique to do what magicians have been doing in front of live audiences for generations.
Fascinating.
This new technology is simply found a way to mimic what stage magicians have been using and doing all along, which is a fascinating idea that film finds as its subject a way to do magic with a different technique, a film technique. Oh. So in this movie, he vanishes the hat and the scarves and the gloves, and then it comes to the streamers that are over on the chair. Interesting to me, he picks up the streamer, shakes it, and the birds come out. The last bit of that is actually performed exactly the way an actual stage magician would perform it. Ah. So here's a fascinating little situation where, to make an interesting film, Edison mimics a magician using film techniques to do some of the tricks, and then finishes with a trick that looks big on film that's done the way a magician would normally do it. So even at that early time, the image of the magician, the practice of the magician, the techniques of the magician are setting a prototype for the things we're going to see in films.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution. We take another step. You can see another film by, I mentioned the famous magician David Devant. In fact, the gentleman in the Edison film is dressed to be exactly like him. Oh. But David Devant was a man who worked in this very famous theater in England and innovated many illusions that led to theatrical techniques that are still used today. Scripting ideas, plot techniques, everything to do with theater, David Devant had a hand in and left a lasting impression on those art forms. He himself became very fascinated with film. So he bought movie cameras and he began working on that himself. And he was using this jump cut technique to replicate parts of his stage act, only using the film technique instead of his standard magic technique, to accomplish a bigger version of things he did on stage. You can look David Devant up on YouTube, and in fact, just so you know, all three of the movies I'm going to talk about right now, you can watch on YouTube. That's another great thing about these films. They've all kind of fallen into public domain. They were lost to the ages because no one cared, but now they are quite the treasured possessions of people who care about the history of cinema.
Fascinating.
You'll find Devant on there picking up a bird cage. Suddenly it becomes much bigger than it was. Then it becomes a potted plant. And there's a film even where he's removing his head and putting it over on the table, just doing things using split screens and superimpositions and jump cuts to create the appearance of magic that he would have done on stage by other means. And then we come to the most fascinating man that's part of early cinema, and his name is Georges Méliès. Georges Méliès was a French stage magician. He had spent his early life being a very successful stage magician and illusionist, and he did an act in keeping with the times. He had the costume, and he had these ornate tables, and there were, flowers and bushes and fans and all these kind of Edwardian, Victorian-looking props in his show, and that's how he was costumed. He had an assistant in the little knee pants and everything from that era, and that was what he did. Well, when movies come along, Méliès is so fascinated with the idea of using film to make magic that he becomes known as the father of special effects.
Indeed.
That's right, folks. Without Georges Méliès, there is no Star Wars.
No.
There would be no Lord of the Rings.
No.
There wouldn't even be a Sharknado.
Oh, no, say it isn't so.
Yeah, he innovated so many techniques. And there's a film that you can see. We actually use it in our show. In fact, after our opening, which is just kind of a rousing way to get you excited about all the things you're going to experience during our live show, the first real film we run for you is by George Méliès, and it's called Whimsical Illusions, and it is from 1909.
Yes.
The truth is, the film was made in 1907, but Méliès and his wife were so committed to giving audiences a magical experience through film, they hand-tinted every frame on the film.
Because, of course, at that point, color had not been invented.
Now, when I say that, you may think, oh, well, that must have been pretty meticulous work. Listen, each frame of this film was about the size of a postage stamp.
Oh, my.
And to do this originally close to 7-minute film, there would have been nearly 15,000 frames.
Goodness.
And that means they went in with illumination behind it and the coloring devices, and by hand they drew in all the color on each thing, each part of the set, each part of a costume, the hair, the face tone. They colored it all in by hand. And they did that on each print of the film.
Oh.
In other words, if you were exhibiting George Méliès' Whimsical Illusions, you received a film in a can that had been hand-tinted. There was no method for cranking out a color film. You couldn't just go make another copy.
Yes.
So that's the level of commitment that Méliès had to his filmmaking and giving people this extraordinary magical experience. And we're so indebted to him for what he did for film.
Yes.
But if you watch Whimsical Illusions, and that's the reason we picked this, of the dozens of films that he made, all of with these magical kind of themes, Whimsical Illusions is staged exactly like a stage magic act.
Oh.
Méliès is there. He's the magician. He has the assistant. He has the cloth. He has the little tables. He has everything that you would see in a performance by a magician at that time. Only he's using innovative film techniques to make the magic happen. And it is amazing to look back on and see the huge influence that his understanding of magic has on the movies and the future of the movies.
Yes.
George Méliès, he became the father of special effects. So, Doctor, did you see the movie Hugo?
Yes, it's a wonderful fantasy movie.
Yeah, it came out a few years ago. It was a film by Martin Scorsese. That was a fictionalized, somewhat a fictionalized account of George Méliès and what happened to him after the heyday of his filmmaking in his studio.
Oh.
And it is a fascinating view of how this man did what he did. And it won an Academy Award. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, it's just a great movie. It's extremely well done. It's gorgeous to look at. The subject is fascinating. The acting is great. It's got humor. It's got everything.
Indeed.
However, Hugo is itself a love letter to the movies and to the origin of what makes us love the movies today.
Oh.
And a lot of that traces back to this genius man over there in France, using his knowledge of stage magic and illusion to innovate film techniques. So hats off to George Méliès, these people who are so involved in making magic a cornerstone of the development of cinema. And that is what we call Cine-Magic.
Oh, what was that? Is everyone okay? And did he drop the piano?
No, he didn't drop it. That wasn't the floor. That sound was the roof crashing in.
The roof?
Yeah. Well, it looks like, quite innocently enough, while they were rehearsing, Karen asked him to, and I quote, "take it from the top." I better go.
This has been the Weekly Flick of Picayune. To learn more about the traveling sensation known as the Sonic Cinema Experience or piano levitation, Visit our website or join us on Facebook. Talk to you again next week.
You've been listening to the Weekly Flick of Picayune, a podcast celebrating the sonic cinema experience. For more information, visit halcyonwonders.com or find the Sonic Cinema Experience on social media. Today's show has been brought to you by the letter A and the dairy food cheese. Thanks for listening, and remember, keep your head up, your heart open, and your magic alive. So long for now.